the question of how old he is. So we know that Mary is likely 13 or 14 years old when she's engaged to be married. Women lived an average life expectancy of 40 or less. They often died in childbirth, and so the men might live a little longer than that. But what we find, and there are some who could live, to be 80 or 90 or 100 at that time, but most women died much younger. Anyway, we think that Mary is 13 or 14 years old, but how old was Joseph? And as we ponder that, if you just read the Gospels as you read them, you would think he's the age of a young man who would get married when the story is unfolding. And so that would be around 16 or 17, because while a woman became a woman when she had her first menstrual cycle, a man became a man when he'd been through an apprenticeship and he could afford to support a family. So once he could afford to support a family, he became a man. That was typically around 16 or 17 years old. So we might think that they're 16 and 17 and that maybe Mary's 13 or 14. But early in the history of the church, there became a sense that maybe Joseph wasn't quite that young. So there's some debate about this among various Christians, particularly Catholics and Orthodox might have a view, some anyway, have a view of Joseph being a bit older. So I want to just say a word about that and where this comes from. In the 2nd century of the Christian era, we find that there's a story called the Proto-Evangelium of James, which is the story of what happens before the Gospels. And it tells us that in this particular work, it's not a biblical work, it tells us that Joseph was 93 years old when he married Mary. 93 years old. What's up with that? Well, and so in this story, at least as I read it, in this story, I think the people who compose this story are wanting to protect Mary from being sullied by actually ever consummating a marriage. And so the idea, the story that developed was that the priests in the temple who were taking care of Mary wanted to find a grandfatherly figure who would provide for her and protect her, but not ever actually be intimate with her. Because at that time, it was thought that being intimate with somebody, actually consummating a marriage was okay for most people. It was fine, but not for the Virgin Mary. And so there was a doctrine that ended up developing in the church called the perpetual virginity of Mary, that she never consummated her marriage to her husband Joseph. She never had any other children. Now, if you read the Gospels, you'll find that there's a mention of Jesus' brothers or sisters. And so this story that develops in the 2nd century is that Joseph had been previously married. He was a widower. His wife had died and left him with these children. And so these are Jesus' half-brothers and sisters. They are not siblings from Mary. And so anyway, not everyone who believes in the perpetual virginity of Mary sees Joseph as very old, but many people did. And so I want you to see this picture. This is from Rennie Guido, and this is a beautiful picture of the elderly Joseph holding the Christ child. Now, again, there are some folks who, and I love that painting, but there are some folks who see, even Catholics who see that maybe Joseph was younger. And so you see this in the second picture that I want to show you. And this is a painting from the early 1900s, a very famous painting. In fact, the portrait of the child, Jesus, was something like 40 million copies of that were made in the early 1900s. This is from Charles Bosser and Chambers. And he shows Joseph as a man who's maybe in his late teens or certainly early 20s when he's father to Jesus. Chambers also believed that Mary was perpetually a virgin, but he pictured Joseph as a younger man. Throughout the history of Christianity, there were many Protestants too who held to this idea that Mary was perpetually a virgin. So Martin Luther, the leader of the Protestant Reformation, still believed in the perpetual virginity of Mary. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, believed that Mary was perpetually a virgin. So there was this idea that you didn't really want to picture that Mary might actually sleep with Joseph. And so the idea of Joseph being older sort of fits well with that, and the other siblings being half-brothers and sisters. Anyway, in Matthew 1:25, though, we read these words in our gospel account today. Joseph didn't have sexual relations with Mary until she gave birth to a son. And so that would imply that they didn't consummate the marriage until she gave birth, but then perhaps they did after that. Again, this is not a matter for great debate within the church, but I just thought it'd be interesting for you to know different ways of looking at Joseph.
Thanks for checking out the weekly sermon from Church of the Resurrection. I pray that God will use this message to speak to you and help you grow in your faith journey. If you're in the KC area, I'd like to invite you to join us next week at one of our services, or join us in live worship online at core.org/worship. Church of the Resurrection is one church in multiple locations. To learn more about the service times in our ministries, please visit core.org. Hope you enjoy this week's message.